15 years later, his eyes still held the same dangerous spark. I stood there, frozen in the dim light of the reunion hall, the air thick with the hum of laughter and the soft clink of glasses, but all I could hear was the relentless thump of my own heartbeat, loud and unsteady, like a drum in my chest. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not after everything. Not after the way he'd left me, shattered, young, and clinging to the pieces of a heart I didn't even know could break so quietly, so completely. I'd spent years rebuilding, stitching myself back together with careful routines and safe choices, convincing myself I'd forgotten him, that the ache had dulled into something I could push to the back of my mind. But one glance, one fleeting moment across the crowded room, and it all came flooding back. The late-night talks that felt like confessions, the stolen glances that lingered too long, the way his voice wrapped around me like a secret only I could keep. He was my mentor, my forbidden what-if, the man who shaped the way I saw the world, and the man who broke me without ever looking back. And now, here he was, standing there in a navy blazer, his hair flecked with gray, smiling like time hadn't carved deep wounds into us both. Why do some wounds feel like home? I wanted to turn away, to run, to pretend I hadn't seen him, to escape before the past could pull me under again. My hands trembled at my sides, my breath caught in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to leave, to protect the fragile peace I'd built. But my feet wouldn't move. His gaze locked onto mine, sharp and searching, and I knew he wasn't here by accident. He came to say something. Maybe to apologize. Maybe to explain. But after 15 years, what could he possibly say to undo the ache he'd left behind, the questions that had haunted me through every quiet night? I wasn't ready to forgive him. I wasn't sure I ever would be. And yet, I couldn't look away, caught in the pull of those eyes that still held me captive, just like they had all those years ago. It was supposed to be a night of nostalgia, nothing more. A high school reunion in a small-town banquet hall, the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades, with fairy lights strung across the ceiling and a playlist of songs we'd all screamed to in our teenage years, songs that once felt like anthems, but now carried the weight of memory. The air smelled faintly of cheap wine and too sweet perfume, and the room buzzed with the forced cheer of people trying to relive moments long gone. I'd almost skipped it. Who really wants to revisit the awkwardness of high school? The cliques that felt like battle lines, the crushes that burned too bright, the dreams you thought were so big until life taught you they were fragile, easily crushed under the weight of reality. But my best friend, Clara, had begged me to come. "It'll be fun," she'd said, her voice all bubbly over the phone, like she was trying to sell me on a trip I didn't want to take. "We'll laugh, we'll dance, we'll feel young again." I'd rolled my eyes, sprawled on my couch with my cat, Juniper, curled up beside me, her soft purring a small comfort against the monotony of my days. But I gave in. Maybe, I thought, I needed a night to remember who I used to be, before the world got so heavy, before routine and responsibility dulled the edges of my life and turned my heart into something cautious, guarded, closed off. I was 33 now, a graphic designer living a quiet life in the city. My apartment was small but cozy, filled with plants that thrived despite my occasional neglect, soft blankets draped over every chair, and shelves lined with books I meant to finish but rarely did. It was the kind of place that felt like a sanctuary after long days of deadlines, client calls, and the endless hum of city life outside my window. Juniper would greet me at the door, her tiny paws patting across the hardwood, and I'd settle into my evenings with a glass of wine and a half-hearted attempt at reading, or maybe a show I'd watched too many times to care about. It was a good life, safe and predictable, the kind of life you build when you're trying to protect yourself from falling apart again. But it wasn't the kind of life that made my heart race, that made me feel alive the way I had at 17, when every moment felt electric, like the universe was whispering secrets meant only for me. Back then, I was all heart, wide open, fearless, and a little reckless, chasing feelings I didn't fully understand, running toward a future I thought I could shape with nothing but hope and desire. And he was the one who made me feel like that, the one who made the world feel bigger, brighter, more alive than it had any right to be, like every day held the promise of something extraordinary. His name was Daniel. Mr. Harper, to everyone else. He was our English teacher, barely 28 when I was a senior, with a smile that could unravel you in seconds and a way of teaching that made you believe stories could change the world. He wasn't like the other teachers, all stiff and tired, droning through lesson plans like they were counting down the days to retirement. Daniel was alive. He'd lean against his desk, sleeves rolled up, his voice warm and deliberate as he read poetry like it was a love letter written to the room, each word carrying a weight that made you lean in, desperate to catch every syllable. His eyes would light up when he talked about books, about ideas, about the way words could hold a heart hostage, could make you feel things you didn't know you were capable of. And sometimes, when he caught my eye across the classroom, it felt like that letter was just for me, like he was speaking directly to the part of me that dreamed too big, that felt too much. I know how it sounds. A schoolgirl crush, right? Something silly, something you laugh about years later when you're older and wiser and know better. But it wasn't that simple. It was never just a crush. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, that made me question everything. The way he'd linger after class to talk about my essays, his voice soft and low, like he was sharing a piece of himself he didn't show anyone else. He'd read my words and tell me they had power, that my voice mattered, that I could make people feel something if I kept writing. The time he brushed my hand while passing back a paper, and neither of us pulled away, the air between us thick with something unspoken, something that made my heart race and my breath catch. The late afternoons in the library, when he'd sit across from me, helping with college applications, his knee just close enough to mine that I could feel the warmth of him, like a current running through me. We'd talk about everything, books, dreams, the future, and the world outside would fade away until it was just us, two people caught in a moment that felt too big, too dangerous, to name. Nothing ever happened. Not really. Not in the way people might think, not in a way that crossed any lines you could point to. But it was there, that unspoken thing between us, heavy with possibility, forbidden and fragile, like a thread stretched so tight it could snap at any moment. And then, one day, he was gone. No explanation, no goodbye. Just a substitute teacher in his place, her voice flat and disinterested as she handed out worksheets, and whispers in the halls that Mr. Harper had left town, moved away, vanished without a trace. I was devastated, but I was too young to understand why it hurt so much, why his absence felt like a betrayal, like a piece of me had been torn away. I told myself it was nothing, that I'd imagined it all, that I'd been a foolish kid reading too much into a teacher's kindness, projecting my own feelings onto someone who was just doing his job. But deep down, I knew, he'd felt it too. He'd felt the weight of that thread, the pull of something neither of us could act on, something that lived in the spaces between words, between glances, between moments. And he'd chosen to walk away, to cut that thread without a word, leaving me to carry the pieces alone, to wonder what I'd done wrong, why I hadn't been enough. So when I saw him at the reunion, standing there in that navy blazer, his hair flecked with gray but those eyes still so piercing, so achingly familiar, it was like the last 15 years hadn't happened. I was 17 again, heart pounding, caught in the pull of something I'd never fully escaped. The room spun a little, the laughter and music fading into a dull hum as I watched him move through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling like he belonged here, like he hadn't left a trail of questions and pain in his wake. But he didn't belong here. Not to me. Not after what he'd done, after the way he'd walked away without a word, leaving me to piece myself back together. He didn't approach me right away. That would have been too easy, too direct, too much like the man I thought he was. Instead, he lingered on the edges of the room, talking to old colleagues, laughing at someone's joke, his voice carrying just enough to reach me, to pull at the edges of my resolve. But I could feel his eyes on me, even when I wasn't looking. Every time I glanced his way, he was watching, subtle, careful, like he was measuring the distance between us, testing whether I'd run or stay, whether I'd let him close the gap or keep him at arm's length. I hated how it made my skin hum, how it stirred something I'd buried long ago, something I'd sworn I'd never let myself feel again. My hands tightened around my wine glass, the stem cold against my fingers, and I forced myself to look away, to focus on the fairy lights twinkling above, the tacky decorations that hadn't changed since we were kids, anything but him. But he was there, in the corner of my vision, in the corner of my mind, pulling me back to a time I tried so hard to forget. Clara noticed me tense up. She'd been my rock back in high school, the one who'd listen to my rants about boys and dreams and the future, the one who'd sit with me in the cafeteria and make me laugh when I felt like the world was too much. But I'd never told her about Daniel. Not really. I'd mentioned him in passing, maybe said something about how he was a good teacher, how he'd helped me with my writing, but never the truth, never the way he made me feel, the way his absence had left a hole in my chest that I couldn't fill, no matter how hard I tried. "You okay?" she whispered, handing me another glass of wine, her eyes narrowing with concern as she studied my face. I nodded, but my throat was tight, my pulse too fast, hammering in my ears. I couldn't tell her. Not about him. Not about the way I'd spent years replaying those moments in my head, dissecting every word, every glance, wondering what I'd done wrong, why I hadn't been enough to make him stay. I tried to lose myself in the reunion, to focus on the small talk, the familiar faces, the stories of who'd gotten married, who'd had kids, who'd landed their dream job or lost it all. I smiled and nodded, laughed at the right moments, but it was all mechanical, a performance to keep anyone from noticing the storm inside me. My mind kept drifting back to him, to the way he made me feel seen, like my thoughts mattered, like I was more than just a kid with big dreams and a notebook full of half-written stories. He'd read my writing and told me I had a voice, a gift, something worth sharing with the world, and I'd believed him, because he said it with such conviction, such certainty, like he could see a future for me that I couldn't see myself. And then he'd left, without a word, leaving me to question everything I'd felt, everything I'd believed about myself, everything I'd thought we'd shared. Then it happened. I was standing by the dessert table, pretending to care about cupcakes, picking at the frosting with a plastic fork, trying to distract myself from the weight of his presence across the room. And then I heard his voice behind me. "Ellie." Just my name, soft and low, like a prayer he hadn't meant to say out loud, like it had slipped from him without permission. My heart stopped, my breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but feel the weight of that single word. I turned, and there he was, closer than I was ready for, his presence filling the space between us. His cologne hit me first, sandalwood, sharp and warm, the same scent that used to linger in the classroom after he'd left, the scent that had haunted my dreams for years. I wanted to be angry, to demand answers, to tell him he had no right to say my name like that, like it still belonged to him. But my voice caught in my throat, trapped behind years of hurt and questions, and all I could do was stare at him, at the man who'd once been everything to me. "It's been a long time," he said, his eyes searching mine, like he was looking for the girl I used to be, the one who'd believed in him, who'd hung on his every word. There was something in his expression, regret maybe, or something heavier, something that made my chest tighten and my hands tremble. "I didn't think you'd be here." "Then why are you?" I asked, sharper than I meant to, my voice cutting through the space between us like a blade. I didn't want to sound angry, didn't want him to know how much he still affected me, but the words came out raw, edged with all the pain I'd carried. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered all too well, one that used to make my stomach flip. I needed to see you," he said, his voice low, almost uncertain, like he wasn't sure he had the right to say it. My heart lurched. Needed. Not wanted. Needed. The word felt like a hook, pulling me back to a place I'd sworn I'd never go again, a place where I was 17 and vulnerable and foolish enough to believe in something impossible. 15 years, Daniel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of everything I'd held back for so long. "You don't get to just show up and say that." "I know," he said, stepping closer. Too close. His presence was overwhelming, like the air itself was pressing against me, heavy with the weight of memory. I owe you an explanation. I owe you so much more than that. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he didn't get to waltz back into my life and unravel me all over again. I wanted to demand why he'd left, why he'd let me believe I was nothing, why he'd taken the one thing that made me feel alive and walked away without looking back. But there was something in his voice, a crack I hadn't expected, that made me pause. He wasn't the confident teacher I'd known, the one who could command a room with a single look, who could make a classroom full of bored teenagers hang on his every word. He was older, softer, carrying a weight I didn't understand, like life had worn him down in ways I hadn't expected, in ways that mirrored the cracks in my own heart. Why now? I asked, my hands trembling, my voice barely holding steady. Why after all this time? He looked down, his jaw tight, like the answer was too heavy to say out loud, like it was something he'd carried for years and still didn't know how to put into words. Because I couldn't stop thinking about you, he said finally, his voice low and raw, each word heavy with something I couldn't name. Not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted leaving. The words hit me like a wave, pulling me under, drowning me in a flood of memories and feelings I'd tried so hard to forget. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly it hurt, so badly it felt like my chest was caving in. But there was a part of me, the part that had spent years picking up the pieces, rebuilding from the wreckage he'd left behind, that screamed at me to walk away, to protect myself from the pain he'd caused. He'd hurt me once. He could do it again. And yet I couldn't move. I was caught, just like I'd been at 17, in the gravity of him, in the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered, even now, even after everything. We found a quiet corner of the hall, away from the music and the crowd, where the noise of the reunion faded into a distant hum, like the world was holding its breath. It wasn't private, not really. There were still people milling around, their voices carrying in snippets of laughter and conversation, but it felt like we were the only two people in the world, caught in a moment that was both too big and too small to contain everything we were carrying. He sat across from me at a small table, his hands clasped tightly, like he was afraid to let them wander, afraid of what they might reach for if he let his guard down. I kept my arms crossed, a barrier between us, a shield to protect the parts of me that still felt too raw, too exposed. But it didn't stop the pull I felt, the way my body seemed to lean toward him without my permission, drawn to him like it always had been. I didn't leave because of you, he said after a long silence, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the hum of the room. I need you to know that. Then why? I asked, my voice raw, the question I'd carried for 15 years finally spilling out, sharp and desperate. You just disappeared. No note, no reason, nothing. I stopped, swallowing the words I wasn't ready to say, the words that would make me too vulnerable, that would lay me bare in a way I wasn't sure I could survive. I thought I'd meant something to you. I thought I wasn't alone in what I felt. I thought you saw me the way I saw you. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his eyes locked on mine, and I saw something in them I hadn't seen before, pain, raw and unguarded, like he'd been carrying it as long as I had. I was scared, Ellie. Of what I felt. Of what it could have cost me, cost us. You were my student. I was your teacher. It was wrong to feel what I did. Wrong to let myself get that close, to let myself want something I couldn't have. My breath caught, sharp and painful, like a knife twisting in my chest. He'd never said it out loud before, not like this, not with that kind of clarity, that kind of honesty. I'd always wondered if I'd imagined it, if the tension between us had been one-sided, a product of my teenage imagination, my heart reading too much into moments that meant nothing to him. But here he was, admitting it, laying it bare, and it made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain, like the ground beneath me was shifting, like everything I'd told myself about those years was unraveling. It was real. It had always been real. I thought about staying. He went on, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper, like he was afraid of the words themselves. About waiting until you graduated, until it wasn't wrong. Until the world wouldn't judge us, or worse. Until I could look at you and not feel like I was betraying everything I was supposed to be. But I couldn't. I didn't trust myself to stay and not cross that line. So I left. I thought it was the right thing to do, the only thing I could do. The right thing. The words stung, sharp and cold, like a slap I hadn't seen coming, like a truth I wasn't ready to hear. You didn't get to decide that for me, I said, my voice shaking, anger and hurt bleeding into every word, spilling out after years of being locked away. You didn't even give me a chance to understand. You just left, Daniel. You left me to think I was nothing, that I'd made it all up in my head, that I'd been a fool for feeling what I did. I know, he said, and there was that crack in his voice again, that fracture that made him seem so human, so breakable, so unlike the man I built up in my mind. I was a coward. I thought I was protecting you, but I was protecting myself. I couldn't face what I felt, what it meant. I couldn't face you, knowing I'd let it go too far, knowing I'd let myself care too much. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to tell him he'd ruined me, that I'd spent years comparing every man I met to him, searching for that same spark, that same feeling of being seen, of being understood, and never finding it. I wanted to tell him about the nights I'd lain awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I'd done wrong, why I hadn't been enough to make him stay, why he'd chosen to walk away instead of facing what we'd both felt. I wanted to tell him about the relationships that had failed because I couldn't let go of him, couldn't let go of the memory of what it felt like to be near him, to be seen by him. But sitting there, looking at him, I saw something I hadn't expected: guilt. Not the shallow kind, the kind you brush off with a quick apology and move on. This was the kind that eats at you, that keeps you up at night, that carves itself into your bones until it's part of who you are. He wasn't here to win me back. He wasn't here to rewrite the past or pick up where we'd left off. He was here to make peace with himself, to lay down the weight he'd been carrying all these years, to quiet the ghosts that haunted him. And that made it worse. Because it meant he wasn't here for me, not really. He was here for absolution, for a way to ease the guilt that had followed him, for a way to move on when I'd been stuck in the same place for years. And I didn't know if I could give him that. I didn't know if I wanted to, if I could let go of the anger, the hurt, the questions that had defined so much of who I'd become. I loved you, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them, raw and heavy, like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples through the air between us. They hung there, suspended, and I saw the way they hit him, like a punch he hadn't braced for, his eyes widening, his breath catching in his throat. I was 17, and I loved you, and you left me without a word. He closed his eyes, like he couldn't bear to look at me, like the weight of my words was too much, too heavy for him to carry. Ellie, he whispered, his voice breaking, barely audible over the hum of the room. I loved you too. That's why I had to go. The confession should have felt like closure, like the answer I'd been waiting for all these years, the piece of the puzzle I'd been missing. But it didn't. It felt like a wound reopening, like all the years I'd spent trying to forget him, trying to move on, had been for nothing. It felt like I was 17 again, standing in that empty classroom, staring at the desk where he used to sit, waiting for an explanation that never came. I wanted to reach across the table, to touch his hand, to feel that connection again, to know it was real, to know that what we'd felt hadn't been a lie. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because no matter how much I still felt for him, no matter how much his words stirred the part of me that had never stopped loving him, I couldn't trust him not to break me again. I couldn't trust myself to let him close, to let him in, when I knew how much it had cost me the first time. The reunion went on around us, the music swelling, the laughter rising, voices overlapping in a cacophony of nostalgia and half-remembered stories. But it was like we were in a bubble, caught in the weight of our own history, the air between us thick with everything we'd left unsaid. He didn't ask for forgiveness, not outright, but I could see it in his eyes, the hope that I'd let him off the hook, that I'd tell him it was okay, that I'd release him from the guilt he'd carried for so long. But it wasn't okay. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I didn't know if I could forgive him, if I could let go of the pain that had become so much a part of me, the pain that had shaped the woman I'd become. "I'm glad you're doing well," he said finally, his voice soft but steady, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "You deserve that. You always did." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, my throat tight with everything I wanted to say but couldn't. I wanted to tell him I wasn't okay, that I'd never been the same since he left, that the girl he'd known, the one with big dreams and an open heart, had been buried under years of doubt and hurt, under the weight of questions I'd never been able to answer. I wanted to tell him about the nights I'd spent wondering what I could have done differently, how I could have been enough to make him stay. But what would that solve? He couldn't undo the past. Neither could I. And saying it out loud would only make me feel more exposed, more vulnerable, than I already did. He stood to leave, and for a moment I thought he'd reach for me, that he'd bridge the gap between us with a touch, a gesture, something to make this moment feel real, to anchor it in something more than memory. But he didn't. He just gave me a small, sad smile, the kind that held 1,000 unspoken words, 1,000 regrets, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd like he had all those years ago, leaving me alone with the weight of everything we'd said, everything we hadn't. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from me, the table littered with crumpled napkins and half-empty glasses, the remnants of a night that was supposed to be light, carefree, nostalgic. The music played on, the laughter continued, but I felt like I was drowning in silence, the kind of silence that presses against you, that fills your chest until you can't breathe. Why do some wounds feel like home? I'd spent 15 years trying to forget him, trying to convince myself I'd moved on, that I was stronger than the girl who'd loved him. But maybe I'd been holding on to him instead, holding on to the pain, because it was the only piece of him I had left, the only proof that what we'd felt had been real, that it had mattered. I don't know if I'll ever see him again. I don't know if I want to. But that night, as I drove home under a sky full of stars, the road stretching out dark and endless before me, the hum of the engine the only sound in the quiet, I realized something. Forgiving him wasn't about him. It wasn't about letting him off the hook or erasing the past. It was about me, about letting go of the weight I'd been carrying, the questions I'd let define me, the pain I'd let shape me. And I wasn't ready. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But for the first time, I wondered if I could be, someday, if I could find a way to let go without losing the parts of myself that still remembered what it felt like to be seen, to be loved, even if it was only for a moment. If this story stirred something in you, share it with a friend who needs to hear it. And comment below, would you forgive him, or walk away?